Hello, my friends. The questions now being thrown at Ukraine's leadership all circle around the same uncomfortable reality. Can any of these so-called peace plans actually work for Ukraine, or are they just designed to buy time for Western politicians? When Zelensky is asked whether he will give up territory to Russia, whether he is being pushed into a rush deal by the Americans, what his message is to President Putin, what role Britain and Europe will play, the answers are always wrapped in slogans about a just and lasting peace. But if you strip away the rhetoric and look at the facts on the ground, it becomes obvious that what is being defended is not Ukraine's interests, but the geopolitical schemes of Western elites who are far more afraid of peace than they are of war. And you see this clearly when you look at what is happening on the front and what is happening in the political salons of Europe at the same time. On the battlefield, Russia is not stalled, not exhausted, not trapped in some stalemate, as Western media keeps insisting. It is moving forward. The latest advances towards Seversk and Lyman confirm that Russian forces retain the initiative and the capacity to push the front line westward. Even the British Telegraph, usually a loyal amplifier of NATO narratives, had to acknowledge that Russia is now taking territory at one of the fastest rates seen since the early phase of the operation almost 4 years ago. When a flagship UK outlet is forced to admit that Russian troops are advancing rapidly just days before a key summit in Downing Street, you know the narrative managers are losing control of their script. The gains around Seversk and Lyman punch a hole straight through the comforting myth that Ukraine is successfully holding the line and that time is on Kyiv's side. Time, in fact, is on Russia's side. Yet, while Russia gains ground, Zelensky jets off to London for a carefully staged display with the big three of Europe, Starmer, Scholz, and Macron. The image is clear. 3 Western leaders and their Ukrainian client sitting stiffly in Downing Street, framed as if they are deciding the future of the European continent. The real purpose of the meeting was not to listen to Russia, not to seek a compromise, and not to end the bloodshed. It was to bring Zelensky into line against Donald Trump's proposed 28-point peace plan. No one in that room wanted an immediate settlement. They wanted to ensure the war continues on Western terms and Western timelines. Macron emerged from the meeting to perform his familiar balancing act. On the one hand, he claimed that Europe and the collective West still have many cards to play against Russia. On the other hand, he insisted that Russia's economy is buckling under sanctions from both Europe and the United States. This is the propaganda line they keep repeating, that nearly 20 rounds of sanctions have finally started to bite, that Moscow is supposedly under intolerable pressure, that a bit more unity and a bit more time will turn the tide. But the reality is the opposite. Russia's economy has adapted, rerouted, and reindustrialized under sanctions pressure, while Europe is the one facing deindustrialization, energy insecurity, and social unrest. Nevertheless, Macron sticks to the fiction that the Ukrainian army is successfully holding off the Russian military, and that all that is needed to secure victory is more unity, more time, and more money. Time and money. Those are the only 2 things Western elites ever ask for when their project is failing. The military facts do not substantiate the story that Ukraine is winning anything. Russian advances contradict it. Ammunition shortages in the West contradict it. The visible exhaustion of Ukrainian manpower contradicts it. But the political class needs the story to continue, so they repeat it. We then get the Politico framing. Zelensky, standing next to these European leaders, announces that Ukraine will not cede any territory. No concessions, no compromises, no recognition of the new realities on the ground. This position is presented as heroic and principled, but it is in fact a refusal to negotiate with reality. The primary outcome of the London meeting was that Zelensky, under pressure and guidance from the Big Three, formally rejected Trump's 28-point peace plan. The West's political class is desperate to block any initiative that might actually end the conflict before they have squeezed every possible advantage out of it. To keep up appearances, they took Trump's 28-point plan and mutilated it into a European 20-point proposal, stripped of anything they consider disadvantageous for Ukraine. In other words, they removed the hard but necessary concessions and left behind a fantasy document that pretends Ukraine can recover what it has lost without suffering further defeat or collapse. Zelensky then proudly explained that all the problematic points for Ukraine have been removed, as if this selective editing somehow brings peace closer instead of pushing it further away. Meanwhile, Scholz mumbled his doubts about any real peace coming out of diplomacy. On that point, he was accidentally honest. No peace can come from diplomacy when the diplomats are forbidden from acknowledging basic facts. Europe claims to be sovereign, independent, and in control of its own decisions, just as Zelensky claims to be defending Ukrainian sovereignty. In practice, they are all following a script written in Washington, Brussels, and the various think tanks and NGO complexes that feed off endless conflict. They wrap it in language about a just and lasting peace, or in Keir Starmer's clumsy phrase, a just and lasting ceasefire. He literally slipped and exposed what this is really about. Not peace, but freezing and managing the war in a way that serves Western strategic aims. They want a ceasefire that preserves their leverage, not a genuine settlement that accepts Russia's security concerns and battlefield gains. They want the war to continue politically, even if the front lines quiet down militarily. To understand why, you have to put yourself in the mindset of the neocons and globalists who are calling the shots. The smarter ones have already admitted to themselves that they are not going to win this conflict in the conventional sense. Victory. As they sold it in 2022, Russia pushed out of all of Ukraine, Crimea returned to Kyiv, Moscow, humiliated, is gone. It was a fantasy from the start. They also know they are not going to get another Minsk-style freeze because Moscow has learned its lesson. Russia will not sign yet another piece of paper that the West uses only to rearm Ukraine for the next round. And they know they are not going to put American boots on the ground in Ukraine. The American public will not accept a direct ground war with Russia. So what's left? Only one strategy. Keep the war going as long as possible. Prolong the conflict, bleed Ukraine, stretch Russia, and hope that something inside Russia breaks an economic collapse, political upheaval, elite fracture, anything that can be exploited. They fantasize that if they can tie Russia down in Ukraine long enough, they might get the collapse they have been predicting since 2014 and never achieved. And here is the truly perverse logic. From the perspective of these Western elites, even a scenario where Russia takes all of Ukraine can still be turned into an asset. If Russia ends up controlling most or all of Ukrainian territory, the West gets a ready-made government in exile to fund indefinitely. Money will flow to this exiled structure, to NGOs, think tanks, and media operations built around it. They get a permanent propaganda machine. They get a permanent justification for NATO's expansion and militarization. Russia is now on our doorstep, closer than ever before. Look how far they've advanced. We must rearm, break flow. The message to European citizens will be simple. Russia is moving westward. Russia has swallowed Ukraine. Russia is now a direct threat to Poland, the Baltics, and beyond. And therefore, Europe must build a war economy. Therefore, Europe must accept more centralization in Brussels, more surveillance, more control from the European Commission, more digital currencies, more suppression of dissent in the name of countering Russian hybrid warfare. And at the same time, these elites get to keep Russia and the United States apart. That is absolutely crucial to their project. A stable, cooperative relationship between Washington and Moscow is their worst nightmare. So they need the war in Ukraine to serve as a permanent wedge, preventing any rapprochement and ensuring that Europe remains the forward operating platform of an anti-Russian agenda. While this logic unfolds, another front opens in the financial war. You have Ursula von der Leyen and other EU leaders increasingly talking about using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine. But as legal and political obstacles become more obvious, Plan B emerges in the form of Eurobonds, a massive loan around 225 billion euros to be raised collectively by the EU and then handed to Kyiv. Each member state would be responsible for a share of this debt. Germany, for instance, might be on the hook for 50 to 55 billion euros, France for 40 to 45 billion. The numbers are calibrated to make the scheme look credible, but what it really means is that ordinary Europeans will be paying for Ukraine's war for decades. This Eurobond approach is not some incidental technical idea. It is a dream long cherished by certain factions in Brussels. permanent collective EU-level debt that turns the Union into a fully fledged fiscal power. Ukraine is just the pretext. They get to create a common debt instrument under the banner of saving Ukraine and then entrench it as the new normal for every future crisis. The conceptual move is very simple. Use war with Russia as the justification for a deeper and more centralized European superstate. To make matters worse, not all of that money is even going into current Ukrainian needs. Roughly 40 billion of the proposed 225 billion euro package is earmarked just to pay off an earlier 40 billion loan from the G7. So Europe is effectively taking out one enormous credit card to pay off another. The original 40 billion, which quietly disappeared into Project Ukraine, is gone. No one seriously accounts for where it went, but the debt remains, and now they are restructuring it under a grand moral narrative about defending democracy and resisting Russia. When European citizens are told not to worry because oversight mechanisms will ensure that the funds are not stolen, they are being insulted. Where were those mechanisms when the first 150 or 200 billion flowed into Ukraine? Are we supposed to believe that none of this was monitored before, but that now suddenly the European Commission has discovered transparency? In reality, the same people who ignored corruption for years are now promising to police it while pushing through the largest Ukraine financing scheme yet. As these financial maneuvers unfold, Zelensky continues his endless tour of Europe. After London, he goes to the Vatican, where he has a symbolic meeting with the Pope, and then on to Brussels for discussions with EU power brokers, including Ursula and various European Council figures. The pattern is always the same. Photo opportunities, statements about unity, declarations that Ukraine will never surrender territory, and behind closed doors, negotiations about how much more money and political cover European leaders are willing to give him. In parallel, you have gatherings like the Doha Forum, where figures such as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, or her counterparts, and other Western officials convene to reinforce the same line. More money is needed for NATO, more investment is required for Europe's eastern flank, especially the Baltics and Finland. Finland, newly in NATO, is praised as the rock star of rearmament, a model for how to prepare for an imagined future conflict with Russia. In other words, the Ukraine war is being used not just as a live battlefield, but as a permanent justification for a wider, long-term militarization of Europe. To make this rearmament palatable, European officials are handed a script. One of its favorite lines is the assertion that in the last 100 years, no neighbor of Russia has attacked Russia, but Russia has invaded 19 neighboring countries. This neat, easily repeatable talking point has now been picked up by various Western politicians and functionaries, including the foreign minister of Finland. It is historically crude and context-free, but it is not designed to stand up to scrutiny. It is designed to create emotional certainty. The point is not to tell the truth. The point is to reaffirm that Russia is the perpetual aggressor, the eternal invader, the enemy that must be contained and countered forever. This repetition of the 19 invasions narrative is part of a much larger effort to rewrite history, especially the history of the Second World War and the Soviet role in destroying Nazi Germany. By erasing nuance and recasting Russia as the villain of every story, Western elites can rationalize any policy they wish to impose: sanctions, asset seizures, censorship under the guise of fighting Russian disinformation, restrictions on banking and cash in the name of countering hybrid warfare, and an open-ended war economy mentality. At the same time, they attribute every unexplained incident in European airspace or infrastructure to a Russian hybrid attack, mysterious drones over Ireland, supposed Russian plots to sabotage cables, and so on. None of this is ever properly proven, but all of it is used to condition the public to think in terms of an inevitable confrontation with Russia. The story being constructed is simple and frightening. Russia has invaded its neighbors again and again. Russia is advancing westward. Russia is conducting hybrid attacks. Therefore, Europe must rearm, centralize, militarize, and remain locked in confrontation for decades. Put all of this together and the picture is clear. The war in Ukraine, from the standpoint of Western elites, is not primarily about defending Ukrainian lives or territory. It is about restructuring Europe, entrenching a transatlantic security architecture aimed at Russia, constructing a permanent narrative of Russian aggression, and preventing any strategic reconciliation between Moscow and Washington. Ukraine is the battlefield, but the true prize, in the eyes of these elites, is a remade Europe. More centralized, more indebted, more militarized, more controlled, and permanently aligned against Russia. In that context, it becomes easy to see why every Western initiative that claims to seek peace actually works to prevent it. A plan that acknowledges Russian gains, respects Russian security demands, and ends the bloodshed would also end the political leverage that this war provides. It would undercut the campaign for Eurobonds, the arguments for a European war economy, the push for tighter centralization in Brussels, and the propaganda narrative that justifies an entire generation of anti-Russian policy. This is why Trump's peace proposal, whatever one thinks of its details, has been targeted for sabotage by Europe's leaders. An actual settlement would deprive them of the very crisis they have built their agenda around. Russia, for its part, understands that this is not only a conflict with Kyiv, but a confrontation with the entire NATO EU complex. It knows that any concession today will be weaponized tomorrow. That is why Moscow has moved cautiously but steadily, expanding its control on the ground while letting the contradictions inside the Western camp deepen. The more Europe bankrupts itself on Ukrainian debt, the more Washington alienates parts of its own public by funneling money into a losing proxy war, the more clearly the underlying reality emerges. The West is fighting to preserve an illusion, while Russia is fighting to secure its borders and reshape the European security order on more honest terms. So when Zelensky vows never to give up territory, when European leaders repeat that they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, they are not describing a path to victory. They are describing a decision to sacrifice Ukraine to a much larger geopolitical gamble. For the neocons and globalists, a destroyed Ukraine, a fragmented and exhausted Europe, and a permanently hostile relationship with Russia are all acceptable collateral damage as long as their power structures and narratives remain intact. The tragedy is that all of this is being sold to ordinary Europeans and Ukrainians as a moral crusade. In reality, it is a cold, cynical strategy that treats Ukraine as expendable and treats Russia as a permanent enemy to be encircled and demonized, regardless of the cost. And until Western publics understand that, the war will be prolonged, not because it is winnable, but because it is useful to those who fear peace more than they fear defeat.